Welcome to part 2 of our deep dive into Sketcher, and in this video we're going to cover the sketch mode interface and also Sketcher options and configuration. So I'm actually going to start in the lower right hand corner. I am in sketch mode. I started a sketch on datum plane 3. In the lower right hand corner, we have our filter. And from here, you can control whether you're able to pick everything in sketch mode or just geometry like lines and arcs and circles that you create, dimensions, or constraints. And I'm just going to leave the default for all. Next, that we'll take a look at the in Graphics Toolbar. And most of the icons in here are the same as in standard part mode, but I want to show you a couple extra ones. First off, you have the sketch view icon, and this one allows you to go from working in a 3D orientation to viewing your sketch plane parallel to the computer screen. Also with this one, I picked DTM3 to sketch on because it's in the middle of the part, and sometimes when you're sketching, the geometry that's in front of your sketch plane will get in the way. So this icon allows you to clip the model. And be aware that this icon was added in Creo Parametric 4.0, I believe. So if you're working in 3.0 and earlier, you're not going to have that available to you. And also in the in Graphics toolbar, there's a drop-down list that allows you to control what's being displayed or not. First off, you have the ability to turn off the display of your dimensions if they are cluttering your sketch while you are creating or manipulating geometry. Also, you can control the display of your constraints. Constraints are just rules that you put on your geometry, like, hey, I want these two lines to have the same length, or these two arcs to have the same radius, make things parallel, perpendicular, make vertices symmetric about a center line, and so forth. I'll come back to grid display in a second. You can turn the display of the vertices in your sketch on or off, and now let's take a look at grid display. You have the ability to turn on a grid while you are sketching, and sometimes that helps people depending on the situation that they are in. And if you turn on the grid, you can also enable grid snap. Let me just jump over to the options to show you where that is. You go to File, Options, and then you select the Sketcher category, and down here you have an option that allows you to show the grid, and there's also a checkbox for snapping to the grid. Let me cancel out of there. And while we're talking about the grid, you're able to control the grid by going to the Setup Overflow menu and then choose Grid Settings. And from here, you can control whether it's a dynamic grid. In other words, Creo Parametric chooses the X and Y spacing based on what you are doing, or you could specify, based on the size of your model. You can also do a static grid, and you can say, hey, I want grid lines every 25 in the X and 25 in the Y, and then when I click OK and repaint, the grid will end up updating. Next up, in the setup for the grid settings, rather than displaying this in Cartesian coordinates, you could also display it in polar coordinates. And let me choose a bigger radial dimension and then click OK. And let me change back to my sketch view. And there you see where we have our grid. Also, when you're using either our Cartesian or a cylindrical grid, the origin can be configured. Right now it's located at the center, the intersection of my sketch references, but you could pick something else. And you can also rotate it an amount that you want. All right, next up, let me turn off the display of my grid. There's also the ability to turn on the display of locks for locked geometry. For example, let's say that I sketch a line, and I can select that line and then lock it so that someone can't grab the vertices and dynamically drag it. When you have your lock display turned on, you can see that there is a little lock icon that shows up on the computer screen. So that's the in Graphics toolbar. Let's take a look at the ribbon. In the last video, I mentioned that you can click on the sketch setup command in order to bring up the sketch dialog box to choose a different sketch plane or orientation reference or flip the sketch. Also from here, you have the ability to access your sketch references. We'll be going into that in detail in the next video. And just like the Graphics Toolbar, you have the ability to go back to a parallel view of your sketch plane from the sketch view icon in the ribbon. And this one has an overflow with some other different options in here. Basically, you have the ability to control display of entities from here. We already went through grid settings, and you can change the line style of entities from the default. And now in Creo Parametric, when you change the line style in sketch mode, it'll be retained when you get out of Sketcher and go back to part mode. The next icon is for file system, and this allows you to import a .sec file. When you are in Sketcher, if you hit the save button, it allows you to save your sketch out to your working directory, gives it a default name, and it stores it with a .sec at the end of the file. And if you click file system, here you have a bunch of different sketches, and if I had some in a folder, I could easily go and grab them. So for example, here's another .sec file that I have out there, and here are ones for my palette. I'll show you the palette in a second. Okay, then we have our pick icon, and normally probably 99% of the time you're just going to stay in pick mode, and you have the ability to pick all geometry or pick all, but again, you'll probably never ever change this. All right, the next set of icons to the right are for centerline and point and coordinate system, but if you look a little over to the right, hey, we have centerline, point and coordinate system over here as well. And so there's a difference between the left set of icons and the right set of icons. The ones on the left will actually generate a datum feature. So for example, you could create points or coordinate systems in a sketch feature and then use them for a point pattern. Point patterns accept both points and coordinate systems as inputs. If you choose to create a center line in the sketch, it'll create a datum axis in the model. And by the way, a little trick. If you are creating an internal sketch for a feature and you put points in your sketch, those points will actually be generated as datum axes normal to your sketch plane. Okay, now we have our icons for creating geometry. I am not going to go through these in here because we'll go through those in detail in the video on sketching geometry, but I do want to mention that you can change between construction mode and solid mode. So for example, when I create this line over here, it's showing up as solid. I could use it for creating geometry with extrude or evolve or one of the other different features later on. But when you turn on construction mode and you sketch different entities, it's creating construction geometry for you, and this geometry would exist only inside of the sketch. It's not available to you in part mode. And if you want to get out of construction mode, you can just click the button, and as we'll cover in a couple videos, you can select geometry, and from the right mouse button you are able to turn it into construction. If you're using Creo Parametric 3.0 or earlier, it's actually going to bring up in the right mouse button menu, it'll say construction in there. Similarly, if you have construction geometry, you could select it, and here we have the command to turn it into solid geometry. In the geometry icons, I will mention one other command over here. You have the ability to grab entities from a palette, and here are a couple of sketches that I have saved out to my disk, and the way that you configure what folder it opens these .sec files is through the configuration options Sketcher Palette Path or 2D Palette Path. Both those do the same thing. All right, let's close out of here. Then we have our icons for editing. So there's the modify icon. What that's really convenient for is swiping over a whole bunch of different dimensions and then modifying them in here. And you can do things like locking the scale. You can change them dynamically with the slider wheels. And also, sometimes you want to make big changes to the value of a dimension. When you try to do it, Creo Parametric gets mad at you and it says in the message area, hey, I can't regenerate to those values. Well, you can turn off the regeneration of the dimensions and change them all in here, and then when you click the OK button, that's when the sketch will update. And there's some other editing icons. We'll go through that in the geometry video. Constraints, I already mentioned constraints. Those are just rules that you're enforcing on your geometry. Then we have icons for creating different dimensions. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention from the operations overflow menu, there are some, let me select a dimension. From the operations overflow menu, there are some other different dimension commands available over in here. And now we have our diagnostics and the feature diagnostics. These are really convenient tools to make sure that if you're having a problem in your sketch, it'll allow you to know what the issue is. So for example, feature requirements. Hey, it says that the sketch must contain geometric entities and the feature meets the specific requirements. If you're using an internal sketch, these requirements dialog boxes become much more convenient. And there are things like you can have it highlight overlapping geometry if you accidentally have two entities on top of each other. Sometimes, especially in very complicated sketches, that is difficult to tell. And it'll also highlight open ends. So for example, when I toggle this, you can see the red highlights of the endpoints of the geometry going on and off. And also we have the ability to shade closed loops. So for example, let's say that I create these other lines in here. Hey, I've created a closed loop, so that's something that would be easily extrudable. And then we have our OK and cancel. In Creo 4.0 and later, when you select an entity, you're going to get a mini toolbar with different icons. And if you hold down the right mouse button, you'll get an additional what's called an asynchronous menu. Everyone just calls it the right mouse button menu with commands as well. And so this is a quick and easy way of getting to different entities and reducing the amount of mouse travel that you are doing. All right, so that is the interface in sketch mode. And I jumped over to the options earlier. I'm going to jump back over to the options again. And when you go to File, Options, there is a Sketcher category. And here's another place where you can control what's being displayed. Also, when you're sketching, it's going to try to guess what kind of constraints that you want. If there's, for some reason, you don't want it to guess different constraints, you could turn off the guessing of those constraints. Okay, let's see over here. I'm going to skip some of these different things. Oh yeah, Sketcher dimension auto lock. So here's a command that will allow you to automatically lock dimensions when you create them. And I'm hovering my mouse over here, and in the tooltip, it'll also tell you the corresponding config.pro option. In other words, this is Sketcher dimension auto lock. And here's where we have the ability to show the grid. You can see that that option is Sketcher DISP grid. And there's also the one for grid snap in here. You can control what kind of grid is the default. For example, maybe instead of having a Cartesian grid, you do a lot of polar coordinates. Hey, you could go and use the Sketcher grid type option in order to set polar as the default. All right, here is one for making the sketch plane parallel to the computer screen when you get into sketch mode. That was the default behavior in Creo, I'm thinking like back in Wildfire 3.0, actually the pre-Creo days. And a lot of people hated how the model would automatically reorient. And so PTC added this option in here for Sketcher starts in 2D, and you can actually change that. The default now is no. Creo leaves you in your 3D orientation. But if you wanted to automatically snap to making the sketch view active, you can do that. All right, some other things for controlling the line color. Here we have things for references where you can have it Creo Parametric automatically create references when you click on geometry if they're not added to your references. I'll show that one in the next video. Here we have the option to allow snapping to model geometry when you are creating different entities like dimensions. And here are the ones for the Sketcher diagnostics. And again, I hover my mouse over these different ones and it'll show you the config.pro option. You can go to the configuration editor and you can set those different options in your file. So for example, I've got Sketcher palette path here. I've got my Sketcher dimension auto lock. If you click the find button, the easiest ways to find options related to sketch mode is to type in the keyword sketch, check the box for search descriptions, and then find now. Oh, might help if I spell sketch correctly. Click find now, and there we have a ton of different options in here, and you could look through them and see if any of them match up with what you intend to do. And if you change any of the different options, then you can export your config.pro file to your default working directory, and that way when Creo Parametric launches, it's going to read in those settings and Creo Parametric will look and behave the way that you want it to. So that is an overview of the sketch mode interface and also Sketcher options and configuration. I hope you enjoyed this video. For more information, please visit www.creowindchill.com. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and click subscribe to be informed when new videos are uploaded. Thank you very much.